or back on the record, going to videotape. For those people just joining us on videotape and on Net Show, I understand this is being broadcast on Net Show. Good morning, my name is Bill Vaughn. I'm currently a developer trainer at Microsoft Technical Education in Redmond. Been at Microsoft 14 years, as I said, and have written a number of books on the subject. This is not an advertisement for my book. This session is not an advertisement for my book, but you might want to write down this website, or it's in your notes. That's my own website. This is the mandatory slide that they wanted me to do. This is going to be like a "you are here" kind of slide, and basically where we're going to be talking about is developing client-tier software and middle-tier software to better access the data tier. Is that a suitable representation of this? You'll see this every single time. You're going to get different opinions. But what we're going to be talking about in this session is getting the most out of your developers and your code written for SQL Server, written in Visual Basic, written in the language that you're most familiar with. Let's ask that question I was going to ask again. How many people here are not VB developers, or like administrators and that sort of thing? You put your hand down when I said administrator. So what do? You code in what now? C++. I'm sorry to hear that, sir. The C++ is in fact a valid language and has a number of excellent uses. If you ask a C++ developer what they're working on, they say, well, I'm working on this comm interface to the voltage, you ask a VB developer what they're working on, says, I'm developing a front-end application for business, for an insurance application. Is that true? Okay. All right. So, performance. Performance, what does it mean? It means a lot of things to a lot of people, and I got a lot of snickers when I gave this presentation the first time. It says, performance. And how do you measure performance? And we're going to be asking that question and answering that question a couple of times. Performance is also, we're talking about not just the code performance, which you're interested in, but in the how much code you can write per week and code that actually works, and you don't have to be called on Saturday afternoon during your barbecue to come repair. And how to measure performance. We're going to look at a number of tools to measure performance, and some things that work and some things that don't. We're also going to be talking about how to get these performance goals out of your applications through a number of techniques, including design, better coding, and through informing your users. No, ma'am, no, that's not a foot pedal kind of thing. He moved my mouse. So, what does it mean? Performance, does it mean faster applications or faster development? We've asked and answered that to some extent. There's certainly a textbook definition of performance. It certainly does mean those applications that get the job done more quickly, or those developers that get the job done more quickly and can go on to other things. How is it measured? It's measured in fewer seconds waiting, fewer aggravated users, fewer bugs perhaps in the code that you develop, fewer lines of code to do the same job, especially when you're working in the middle tier, active server pages, for example. If you write fewer lines of code, it turns out that the applications run faster, because in the active server page in today's technology, we find that code is interpreted line by line by line by line, which is very different than the code you write in VB compiled, which is compiled up ahead of time and then executed and is dramatically faster. We also find it's more units per second, more pages per second, more rows per second, more connections per second, more lines of code per day, per hour, whatever. More satisfied customers certainly as a result here, and certainly more repeat business. Of course, that goes without saying. But the design plays a big role here. So all too often, I hear from consultants that say, I'm using a such and such design where the client wants me to bring back 15,000 rows. to the client and to the browser or to the client application. And that's having to work with a system that already exists. In other words, how many people step into sites where the code already exists and you have to repair it? How many have to do that? Yeah, 'cause that's really very typical. And how many of you think those applications are really built on solid frameworks? Yeah. So often we're having, as consultants, we're asked to go into situations where things have really degraded, and the customers they really have spent a lot of money on this design that their cousin developed, or brother-in-law, sister, have developed, and now they're stuck with it, and they're going to say, I want you to make this work. And I says, well, to make this work, we basically start with F-disk, and go from there. But they don't want to hear that. Oh, I've got 17,000 million hours in this. I got $12 million invested in this architecture. You better make it work, pal, or you're out of here. Fine. If it was me, I'd feel free. But many of us are not independently wealthy and have to really work with these customers and try to repair these damaged kidneys and these collapsed lungs that have been caused by smoking for all those years. So we want to find the right solution for the customer, even though we may have to foist that solution on them. We also want to find the right solution for the systems we're working with. This is the hardware that we're working with. How many people are working with Pentium 3 700 systems for everyone? Very few of us. Most of us are working with older systems. And my servers at the house, and I've got a very nice server farm at the house. I have an industrial rate for my electricity. I'm using Gateway P5 120s, and it's a P560 with a doubler in it, and a P5 133. That's where I've got Windows 2000 Server AS on, actually. And it works fine for my testing environment, and it certainly, I think you'll find customers that have a lot of this older hardware that they're trying to leverage. But we also have to find the right system for the developer. Often we find a choice of the choice of one architecture over another has more to do with the comfort level of the developer. Is this gentleman over here who codes in C going to propose a Visual Basic solution? No. Is this gentleman over here who codes in VB going to propose a C solution or a FoxPro solution? Probably not. So it's the technical choice between ADO and DAO and ODBC API or OLADB directly often has to do with your comfort level. How many people are comfortable with programming straight to the OLADB API? API. And you do this in what language? C++. Okay. How many program to the OLADB directly in VB? It should be a null set. Okay. How many people program the ODBC API from VB? We still have, that's not a bad solution, and we'll show you where this fits in the architecture, but it requires a certain level of expertise. Sir, would you be comfortable in coding the ODBC API from VB? Not very comfortable. And that's not an untypical answer, so he would probably not choose maybe an optimal solution because you're not comfortable with it, and you have to support it. You have to write the code for it. You may have to teach somebody else how to do it. So it's often the developer's skill that has a big factor in the solution here. So we're going to be talking about a number of these factors, including smarter design strategies, but also smarter COM strategies. So much of our stuff is tied together with COM. And COM is a big player here. Question, does the ODBC API use COM? Maybe one of the reasons why it's so much faster is it does not have a COM overhead. And sometimes you may have to step aside from COM, but COM can give us a lot of ease of development. They can really make things glue together more easily, snap together like Legos, because it has standard Gazinta-Gazada interfaces. And all of the tools nowadays are designed to work with COM. Clear into the middle tier. We're also going to talk about smarter coding strategies, as well as smarter ADO strategies. But first, we're going to focus on the right solution for the right environment. I've been using this diagram. I usually draw this up on a whiteboard, so it is not nearly as intimidating. At the top of the triangle here, now this is a distribution. This triangle represents the distribution of, can you catch me over here if I walk over here? So we've got down here at the bottom, and well, let's start with the triangle. The triangle itself, it represents all the applications in your business, or worldwide, or whatever, how the ever applications are distributed. And some of your applications in a medium-sized corporation are going to be fairly low intensity. For example, the 3x5 card file that's your reception, the Rolodex. That's a database, right? Convince your secretary to get rid of that Rolodex and use a database for that. She may quit for good reason, because the Rolodex is always online. Works in a power failure. So when she's calling the fire department, let's see, that's fire. Here, yeah, I got it. But if the laptop's down because there's no power. On the other end of the scale, we have applications that require an awful lot more power. In other words, applications where you get not 1 million hits per millennium, but 1 million hits per minute, or 1 million hits per hour. Things like some of the most profitable websites in the world. Yeah, you know the ones I mean. They have an awful lot of activity. Or Microsoft.com, or one of those big, the eBay, or one of those giant sites where they get all this activity and they need a web farm and a big set of power. So the application architecture you use for this end of the triangle is very different than this end of the triangle. Question, would you use one of those 8-way, 12-way Pentium systems to run the Rolodex system for your corporation? Well, if you had one just lying around, you probably could. I don't think so. So we have the appropriate architecture. Access database perhaps falls in this range here, where we have an awful lot of companies that are using that. And what should be drawn here is a kind of a squiggly line that breaks where the access database really doesn't do the job anymore, and we start getting into client-server architectures where SQL Server and perhaps Oracle fit in here. Now, SQL Server is certainly pushing this direction. You saw the talk today where where Paul was talking about how the WinCE version of SQL Server, the one that has the RAM, the 8 gigs of RAM, the pack you stick them back, they got around. Or the refrigerator magnet database. You've seen those. You have the on the door. You have everything. You take something out of the refrigerator, you scan it, and yeah. Did you reboot the system? Yeah. I know you can't get your milk out later. Your kids are crying. You can hear the kid in the background. Okay, what version of ADO are you running? You didn't install. Okay, you've been browsing through the refrigerator again. Didn't we tell you not to do that? So you can see ADO and these other issues working toward this direction, but you also saw Paul's talk where we're pushing the technology more and more in this direction too. And that wavy line starts getting even grayer in this area as we work into middle tier and COM plus and MTS architectures. Question, do we develop the applications in this area the same way, using the same tools, using the same paradigms, using the same techniques, using the same people as we develop in here? No. And many of us can cross-fertilize, but you'll find that people have specialties, a client-server specialist, a COM plus middle tier specialist, and maybe beyond. People that can architect and design and work with systems much in the top end of that pyramid. If you draw the money pyramid on this, it's inverse. These guys, 89 database, including the tin box. Here, $89 million database on the other end. And so the number of users is inversely proportional here. If you have a single user, nobody's going to share the Rolodex while Sally's using it. And on the other end, we've got databases that can be seen by everybody in the world simultaneously. Just ask IBM in the Winter Olympics, or this is the Summer Olympics. Never mind. So we have smarter comm strategies we're going to be using too. And let's get into the technical side here. In this case, when we're building COM objects, in order to make these objects work better, in order to make your applications work better, we encourage you to recycle these objects. In other words, when you're building a command object, if you build a command object in a click event, in other words, you have this is a client-side application, for example. If you have a click event on a button that says dim X as command, set command equals new command, and then go ahead and populate that command, and then execute the command, and then get out of the click event, what have you done? You spent all that time constructing the object, using it, and then throwing it away in the same operation. What about the middle tier? Don't we do precisely that? It's not a click event. It may be a customer lookup object, okay? And here we're declaring a command object because we want to execute a stored procedure. And we're setting up a bunch of input parameters. We then execute that command object, passing in the parameters, and then right at the end of that, we pass back the record set, right? What happens to the command object? It's tossed. What happens to the record set object? It's tossed. Well, actually, the record set is now persisted someplace else. It's sent down the wire. But the command object is gone. What about the connection object? Well, the connection object was, we had to build that somewhere to get connected. But it was being pooled by connection pooling. So we are, in fact, saving that to some extent, but the command object not. What's the fastest way? Here's a test. Your first test. You'll be graded on these afterwards, be filling out an evaluation form. What's the fastest way to execute a parameter-based stored procedure in code? Fewest lines of code. No, anybody? Anybody? What's that now? Connection.exe. What if you did, let's say the name of my stored procedure was AU42. What if I said cn, that's my connection object, I said cn.au42. Followed that by the two parameters that it takes. Followed that by, let's see if I still have my demo up. Can we switch to this? 2. I have good news and bad news about this code. This code worked in 2.1. It worked in 2.5. But from here down, it doesn't work in 2.6. That's just an issue. But here, I'm opening a particular connection. And here, I'm simply executing the stored procedure AU42. Well, there's something missing here. This executes the stored procedure AU42, and I can make this bigger. Would you like me to make this bigger? Tools, options, editor format. We'll stick with Courier. It really sucks. But I'm more of a, you've seen this MS, or is it Trebuchet? This is a very cool font. Oh, not that one. Turkish. Not sure that will help. But notice here that I'm executing this stored procedure, AU42, simply by referencing on the connection object. Is that interesting? That's very interesting. That's one line of code. Question, what's going on behind the scenes? Is ADO constructing a command object for me? No. It's leveraging the connection object. Cool. And it's going into the pool just like it would. We're passing in input parameters. What cannot you do here? What's missing here? What's that? Output parameters, precisely. So if you have to deal with output parameters, which are an important performance benefit, instead of passing a record set back, I want to send back output parameters. Much more efficient. Or simply pass back the return status. Yes, no. Yes, there are hotels. No, there are not. Yes, no. Much, much faster than constructing a record set. But here, we're building a executing stored procedure, passing in input parameters, and question, what about the O'Malley situation? So for the second parameter was a string, somebody's name, and I entered, quote, apostrophe O'Malley, would that break it? No, this is also being dealt with under the covers for us. This is cool. And in the middle tier, where you want to cut down the number of objects, go in an active server page, it can save you time. So,
you can get back a record set from that.
Absolutely. That third parameter there was simply the record set. This is the record set.
So the last parameter is the record set?
The last parameter, whatever it is the record set. Question, is this documented anywhere? Anybody seen this documented?
No.
You didn't read my book. This has been in my book from the very beginning. This is called a query as method, and this was in RDO. And they put it in ADO too. Unfortunately, now I used to be in the doc team, so I get to complain about these guys. I wrote the documentation for VB2 and 3 and 4 and 5 for data access stuff. And what we did is we opened up, when we started using COM in the VB4 timeframe, we would open up the COM object layer and we'd document everything that was in the object tree. Question, is this going to show up in statement completion? Is 8042 going to show up in statement completion? No. Is it going to show up in the object browser? No. So you're not going to see it until it actually works. So you kind of have this kind of that where you remember Indiana Jones where he stepped out and this kind of a leap of faith kind of thing. Question, what if 8042 structure changes? What if they change the number of input parameters? Are you SOL here? Yeah. But so are you with a command object. So this also requires something that many organizations, including Microsoft, don't always have, and that's discipline.
So while this takes less code, is it actually very fast to execute because it has to figure out the certain procedure?
No, it turns out that it is just, I'm seeing only minimal overhead here. Especially consider the active server page case. Because there's less lines of code to compile, if you will, interpret. We also want you to discard these single-use objects quickly. In other words, this is like working in a, have you ever lived in a commune? No, and I grew up in the 60s. There was a lot of commune living. And people, you have to push the right button for you to see this stuff, don't you? Where you want to share things in your application, where now you're sharing COM objects. So you're going to pick up these objects, and you should close unneeded connection objects, close unneeded record set objects as quickly as you, dead chair, as quickly as you can. You also want to set these objects to nothing. Question, shouldn't the tear down at the end of a click event, for example, of a VB procedure tear these down for you? Do they always? Apparently not, because this solved a lot of problems, a lot of memory leakage problems that just kind of crop up. So if you tear these down yourself, you know they're dead. Then you drag their bodies out and burn them. Set objects, nothing. Also, do not use dimx as new. How many still people do that? It's okay. This is something that that really bites a lot of us because the documentation and some of the examples, even the best practice examples show this technique. When you say dimx as new, bad things happen. The fallout. When you say dimx as new, every time you reference the object, you get, if xx is nothing, then set xx equals new yy. So if you say dim rs as new record set, you'll get every time you touch the record set, or the field object, or any of its properties, okay, you'll get if record set is nothing, then set record set is equal new record set. Set RC new record set every single time. This doesn't add a lot of assembly language code. If you've looked at it, it only fills about 3/4 of the page when you're looking at it in the device. So it's not a lot. It doesn't take that long to run, and it is so much easier to say that than not. But what we're encouraging you to do is use dim rs as record set, dim cn as connection, dim cmd as command, and then set when you need the object. That way the object gets instantiated in memory when or if you need it at all. You manage the instance. Make sense? Okay. That'll save you another 5%, 10%. We also encourage you to set objects to nothing. For example, when we close the record set and we set it to nothing, but we want you to set properties to nothing. We're not setting here, we're assigning nothing to this property. Here, you're going to save another piece of assembly language code. Remember, we're trying to save 2% here, 3% here, 5% here. This will save you a little by not using the set command with this particular property. And we often do this when we disconnect a record set in the middle tier, active server page, middle tier component. We're sending back a disjoint record set. We set the active connection to nothing. But in this case, we just assign active connection to nothing to make it run a little faster.
Good question?
Yes, sir.
Can you go back?
No.
Please?
All right, just a minute. This is one of those silly, tiny keyboards.
Oh.
Okay, there we go. I found it.
If you're setting your options to nothing, you need to explicitly close them before you set them?
Once they're set to nothing, you're going to have a great deal of difficulty closing them.
No, I meant the other way around. Can you just set it to nothing, or do you have to close it for you?
I would recommend closing, because the close method has a number of things that it does in the hierarchy. In other words, you are setting other companion states. In other words, it's telling ADO that we were finished with this and do the formal teardown. If you just set it to nothing, it's like You know you can stop a Lycoming L13 jet engine by sticking a 4x4 in it? That's the same thing. And maybe it's a good idea to shut it down before you do that. I've done that in Vietnam. I flew to this fence. Yes, sir.
I guess with active connection, if active connection is pointing to a connection object, in both cases you're going to be releasing the interface pointer. I guess I wasn't really clear why not doing the set state. Because of the nature of VB and the nature of COM in this particular case. In this case, you can save some time. When you're setting an object to nothing, there's a different sort of COM protocol going on. In this case, we're simply talking about a property. And the property is not an object, you see. So we're basically, it may be pointing to an object. But in this case, we can get away with just say active connection equals nothing. And is that something that would be likely to change in another version of VB?
Would this likely change in another version of VB? I can make absolutely no guarantees for the next version of VB. Is that clear? This will work in 6.0 forever. The other issue that we find in the field is, and in the examples that I've seen out in the web, is that we have an awful lot of people coding RS, quote, field name issue. This is extreme. Anybody know what the name of the column that I'm referencing here? The name of the column in the record set is my field name. There's no question. Everybody in the room who speaks, reads, and writes English, and even those that don't, know what the name of that column is. What's the column that I'm referencing in the first one? BHOM. We don't have any clue. So it requires you, in the lower case, in the bottom case, we know exactly, the human knows what's going on, but the computer has no clue because it has to look it up using late mining. In other words, he's going to have to take the fields collection and walk through, is this the one? Is that 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 the one? Until he gets really bored or it finds it. And this can slow things down dramatically. I'll show you a graph here in a second. So I recommend that we use by ordinal. Question, the human interface here is gone. So if somebody comes back to your code and says, hey, how does this work? What's R sub 0? Let me just dig into the select statement. Is this the right select statement that goes with this record set? Maybe. Maybe you don't know. Maybe it comes from the middle tier. I don't know. You don't know. So you're going to have to find some other way so the human can actually, remember, we're working with human interfaces here too, can figure this out. One thing you can use is comments. Comments, however, do not dynamically change, except in disciplined organizations where you have people that do nothing but keep comments up. And do they have one of those people, Hank? I didn't think so. Making a further highly granular reference here to the COM value property, which is what we're really doing here, it turns out is slightly slower, but the difference here is probably a mathematical aberration. And as we get further and further down, notice the bang syntax is also very popular. It's popular because I said it was in the documentation back in the VB3 time frame, and it turns out that that was no longer the case once we got into COM. So these techniques we used to think were cool are no longer very fast, and I'll show you the difference here. This yellow bar here is the RS sub 1, the ordinal reference. Here is the my call reference by string, and the bang syntax is just as slow. The one that's really terrible is if you pass the name of the string, the name of the column in a string. You get to pick it. You just stick it in whatever. So you have a generic routine, which is even slower. So this is something else, another way you can improve performance. Yes, this works in the middle tier, active server pages. Again, this is a way to help performance, and this will give you a big boost. One of the other ways you can get around the human interface side here is to create enumeration. And these are not hard to build, but again, require discipline in the sense that your organization can't be monkeying with the enumerations unless, if you change the SQL statement, you have to change the enumeration. So when you do a select star, you don't know what order these guys are going to come back in. What order do columns come back when you say select star? It's up to the SA. And we have some really cool tools now in SQL Server that let you move the columns around. Hey, I think I'm going to alphabetize them this week. No. Let's do them by the longest name first this week. And so that can change the way some programs work. In those cases, you may want to go back to the strings. So we have an enumeration here for each of those fields, and once we've got the enumeration built, we can then reference the record set object, enumField.age, now refers to the 0, 1, 2, the second, or the third, actually, element in the record set fields collection. Notice we're also fully qualifying the text property of our text box. You'll find that in ADO, especially the newer versions of ADO, it gets more and more sensitive about what's on the right-hand side of the expression, because the record set object can now accept almost anything. And sometimes he says, oh, I see what he wants to do. He wants to pass that text box in the record set. Okay. Not the value property, but the whole box. Okay. Aren't variants fun? You also want to use smarter COM strategies by using shortcuts to these COM references. In other words, another thing we could do here is we could use the for each looping here. You've seen this before. I'm sure you've seen this. Where here we're walking through the connection errors collection, and we're using this ADO error description and number inside this loop. We may even get away with saying with outside as well. And the with syntax can also save you time, especially developer time, and especially remember the number of characters being interpreted in the middle in the active server page makes a difference here too. So with syntax is also important here. So let's look at smarter connections and back up one. We're going to be looking at connection object, command object, and record set objects in more detail here in our coding. We also want to look at and we'll focus as we go here on active server pages and on client side or the middle tier and on the servers, because the way we write code for each of these tiers is different. For example, in the client server world where we have in-process COM objects, I can say a customer.age equals 45. And I know that the property routine that deals with that particular code, that particular property change will in fact fire. And in fact, I can say if customer age is 45, then we know that training wheels on the bicycle are not required. Or we can make that assumption. There are certain other assumptions about the age. However, in the middle tier, you should not be persisting properties in the middle tier. We don't create objects, hold them, set property, set property, set property, then persist there. We send a method that says add a customer, here are the 12 parameters, go add the customer, and then finish and get out. If we use the former, in other words, we're setting properties one by one in the middle tier, we're slowing the operation down considerably. So the way we approach problems is very different. Now, one of the things we need to talk about is connection strategies. Now, connections are a limited resource in our SQL servers, especially those people who are buying the licenses. Now, Microsoft, we have a few problems. Anybody actually read the license? Yeah. What do you think about that part where it says about your firstborn child? I've always thought that was very strange. So those of us who are buying licenses are, in fact, vitally concerned with the number of licenses we have and the number of connections we're going to be able to permit. For the other situations where you have a more unlimited license, a more unlimited connection strategy, you still are going to want to be able to build in scalability into your application, so it's not headbound by the number of connections the server will support. So one of the approaches that we use, and it's not an invalid strategy at all, is the static. In other words, we open up a connection for the life of the application and hold it the whole time. Now, the application may live on the administrator's desk, and he or she may hold this application open. As a matter of fact, he or she may go home at night and leave the connection open all night. And that's not an invalid strategy if the server is only supposed to support 100 people and there's 50 people in the whole organization. It's not a big deal. It also means that you don't have to worry about connections being up. It's just up all the time, except when the server goes down for maintenance, then you're going to have to deal with it anyway. The other approach that we're using quite a bit is the just-in-time. In this case, the application connects only when it needs the connection, performs the operation, and then sets a timer. And in those applications, if you listen closely, you can hear the timer tick, 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 tick. Maybe not. But after the timer goes off, we end up getting into a situation where the connection is dropped for us automatically. This releases the connection on the back end, or at least it releases it back to the pool. The application is designed to check to see if the application connection is still going, and if it's not, it needs to reestablish it just in time. We also can leverage the connection pooling available in OLADB. In this case, we open a connection, but we don't really open it at all. It's the ODBC connection pooler that opens it for us, and we basically borrow one of those connections. The problems associated with this are that those connections may be orphaned, or if you don't know how this works, you may end up with a lot more connections than you know about. You'll also discover that these connections, you basically inherit someone else's state. Now, what is SQL Server state? What happens when you open a SQL Server and you do a use DB? Well, you've changed the state of the connection. So the next person that comes along and opens that connection, what are they going to get? They're going to get, say you said use pubs. They're going to get pubs as their default database, unless they say specifically what they're doing. And there are dozens of those state settings that you can make from your application. So when you're using connection pooling, you just have to be careful that you're not having someone else reuse your own state. We're also looking at our, now we have ADO 2.1 and later, we can dissociate or we can disconnect at will. This means that we can establish a connection, open a record set, pull down the record set, and then close the connection. Party down on the record set for as long as we like. Persist the record set locally to a file. Or maybe send it someplace, an XML. Or do whatever we want to with it. Bring the record set back. We're ready to make adds, changes, deletes. We've done that. We send it back to someplace, or we simply reconnect ourselves. We reassociate the connection and make the changes. And this is a very cool feature and not a bad approach to dealing with these connections. It deals with the issue of the person going out to lunch or going on vacation with a connection open. We also can extract data for the first time from a URL. In this case, we're not really making a connection in the same sense. We're actually hitting a URL very quickly, pulling down maybe XML data and building a record set from a web page. Another approach is not to connect at all. And this is an ADO approach that has just come online in the ADO 2.1, 2.5 has improved on this approach. This way we can create a locally persistent record set in the sense that we can create a record set out of the blue. Now, it's not all a bunch of tables. It is certainly a single table, if you will. But you can, once you've built this, you can append the fields, you open it, and it's frozen. And then you can add, change, and delete all you want. You can filter, sort, and do whatever you do with a record set as much as you want. Now, another trick here is to construct this in-memory record set not using the declare and the append fields in the open method, but using the open method directly against the SQL Server by saying select star, in this case, from table where 1 is equal to 0. This will bring back just the DDL. You have a constructed table. Now you can close the connection, add, change, and delete all you want to this table as if you're adding new rows. Make sense? Okay. So the connection strategies, there's a number of values here and trade-offs that you're going to have here. Instant connections, the connection persistence approach here, and where we keep the connection open, the static approach, means we have an instant connection. We don't have to worry about it. It's always open. The pooled connections are always open, but there is some overhead involved with that. In fact, when you use a pooled connection, what he has to do, especially think about the middle tier where you have thousands of possible connections. He has to search through those strings. String. Got it. Fine. This is okay. This matches number 27. No, I don't have an open one. I'll go ahead and open one. Or yes, I have an open one. You can share number 45 here for you. You also want to consider how many total and active users you have. Often we have to build a connection strategy around how many people are actually going to be connected at any one time. And anyone beyond that is given a polite, no, you can't get in. We also want to look at local record set persistence and creation in the sense that we want to be able to build record sets and manage them without use of connections or with only infrequent use of the connection. And scalability and performance are our bottom lines here. And the better connection strategy approach you have, it can directly deal with performance. Now, how long does it take to open a SQL Server connection nowadays? Your experience. 5 seconds? How many think 5 seconds to open a SQL Server connection? Anything you can't get open in 5 seconds? Longer? 10 seconds? Or lower? 2 seconds? 1 second? Under a second. Under a second. So it depends on whether it's the first connection or whether it's a subsequent connection. It makes a difference. And whether or not there's pooling involved makes a difference. And whether or not the server is busy and how much MPEG is being transmitted over the wire makes a difference. Whether you're going over a modem or not makes a difference. And whether the hotel picks up, hello, are you going to use that line much longer? Makes a difference. We also have to decide what kind of connection approach we're going to make. Whether we're going to be using ODBC or native OLEDB providers in Visual Basic, Visual Studio, even Visual C. When we're using ADO, the choice here often has to do with features and functionality, because Microsoft is still working on both the OLEDB interfaces and the ODBC interfaces. They're both still being actively changed. So we're seeing improvements coming along the lines, tightening up the security, improving different aspects of it, better data, better connection management, and so forth. We also have to decide whether or not we want to use a DSN or a universal data link. And both of these have their benefits in the sense that they encapsulate the entire connection string. Even the security information can be persisted in the connection string in the new versions. Good idea. UDL is a plain text file. The DSN, on the other hand, is in the registry and requires somebody to do a registry hit. Not too difficult for somebody to crack into your security. So capturing and using passwords is an issue here as well. We also have to look at how the connections are being cached and managed. Because if you're changing the username, for example, you're not going to get cached connections. Every username is different because that changes the connection string. And that's what he's testing in a pool. So we can also hard code the server name, the IP, or the URL if we want to in our applications. But some people say we want more flexibility than that. I want to be able to go to a variety of servers. So perhaps capturing that later. Yes, sir?
What's the difference between the ODBC connection pool and the OLEDB connection pool?
You will not see any difference. It's really been handled by the same layers. And in both cases, we're simply looking at the connection string. Is it an exact match on the connection string? Now, what the OLEDB and the OLEDBC and the ODBC connection managers, the poolers, are doing is they're ripping off some of the pieces of that connection string and sticking on their own so they don't match the workstation ID and some other things. You'll also find that ADO itself is reorganizing your connection string so things are in a standard format. So just because you provide the parameters out of order, it's still constructed correctly. When am I supposed to be done with this? Now? When? So we have a half an hour? Good. All right, we're on schedule. Okay. When you connect, you also need to be ready for the, they made me change this, for the stuff that happens. PC. Question, the errors that come back from ADO, they're translated. They're translated into Spanish and French and Italian and Polish and Clevelandese. Should you be displaying those messages to a user, end user? No. Those messages are for developers. They are for you. They are for you to understand what's going on. They are not designed for the end user. Although some of them are kind of friendly, some are not quite so friendly. You'll also discover that there are a whole slew of perfectly normal things that happen when you make connections. When the yellow cable in the back was unplugged by the vacuum cleaner lady, they came to do the vacuum, or she ran over, sucked it up, or whatever. Those kinds of errors can manifest themselves in a variety of ways, and it's your responsibility in your application to deal with those in intelligent ways. We also want to avoid these tools and controls that don't let you get at these errors. For example, when you're working with the data control, the ADO data control, the data environment designer in many cases, you'll discover that the errors occur before form load, long before you have an opportunity to capture the error, to trap the error. You'll also find that if you don't set the prompting levels correct, if you say, leave the default in the data environment designer, for example, it will prompt you whenever something goes wrong. For example, if the user ID and password is wrong, or it just simply can't connect, it'll throw up a dialog. Hey, what's your username and password? You can choose a database here if you want to also. Oh, that wasn't right. You want to try again? And again, and again. And the person gets a guess until they get it right. If you don't want that to happen in your application, if you want to maintain control, make sure those prompting levels are set correctly. Now, in the default in ADO, it is set correctly. It's set to prompt never. But remember, in the data environment designer, the data controls, it's not. Now, you also want to watch out for residual state. As we work with pooled connections, remember that some other person, some other developer in your organization, maybe not in your organization, you just bought another company. And it's all those guys. Okay, it's always those guys. Have changed the connection state. They opened a connection and then changed the state. So you may have inherited the connection, but you inherited that person's state as well. We also want you to try to avoid trying to invent things yourself. Creating your own objects, for example, may be an issue here. We've already discussed that earlier. We also want you to leverage those connection strings. I teach ADO to the Microsoft developers, and often what they have, the biggest problem with developing a code here is coming up with a correct OLEDB or ODBC connection string, especially as we get to the more sophisticated providers. A VB will develop these for you, and it does it very easily. And there's a couple of tricks you can use here. For example, let's do this code again here. We'll go back to our form. And the way that I've found, let's create a little more room for me here, and we'll do it high enough on the form so you can actually see from the back. We have something called the Jet Data Control, don't use it, the ADO DC. Okay, right-click, Properties, and it throws up a property page here that lets you build a connection string. Now, we're taking this rather obtuse way of getting at this dialog. Instead of using the data environment designer, instead of using the data view window, we don't use the data view window because it does not expose the connection strings in a way that you can put them in the clipboard. Okay? Here they are, but you can't touch it. Not bitter at all. So here we have the ability to pick our server name. Now, I've got a server running here, so I'm going to just say local. By saying local, you also short-circuit the networking. In other words, we're not going to have to resolve this network name, even though it happens to be right here. So he doesn't have to go out through the NIC and come back in again. We can pick the kind of a username and password here. Something else that I've seen an awful lot, and he mentioned that, Paul mentioned this in the keynote. How many people are developing with SA no password? Come on. Okay. Do you know how many problems you're hiding by doing this? You're really masking a whole series of things that can and will go wrong when you switch to role-based security. And really, I have to do it here because I didn't set up the server. This is not my server, I'm very sorry. But in my classes, I use admin with a password here. And you'll be alarmed at the number of things that go wrong just by setting a username. You have to set up permissions. You have to have permit rights, and you have to say, series of things that will not be exposed if you use SA no password. So just as I have to use it here, I'm very sorry. As I said, I didn't set this thing up, and I'm going to set blank password. If you say allow saving password, what happens, this is what Paul was talking about. If you say allow saving password, it will embed this SA no password right in the connection string, which is also not a good idea. And I'm going to turn this off. Then you can select the database on the server. If you can pull down this drop down here, of course, you've just opened the server connection anyway, and we can pick from this list. So it's not a bad idea to pull that drop down. So if it's not going to work, if this comes back as blank, it means that there's no databases. It means that you don't have connectivity. You can push this test connection button if you want to, if it makes you feel better, but we've just tested the connection. The other advanced tabs are also not really necessary here. So what we've got here, we've built our basic connection string. We can say, okay, and guess where this puppy arrives? It arrives right here. Control insert. Where's the silly insert key on this? Maybe these elite keyboards. Okay, once we've dropped that, I can close this, go back to my form, and I can stick this right up here. Let's create a new open. And I can stick my connection string, shift, insert, right there. Notice that we've got some extra stuff here that we didn't really talk about directly. There. So we have the provider's been filled out for us. Notice it has the .1. That means we're going to use version 1 of the OLEDB provider. If I don't care what version, I can do this. That doesn't hurt anything. The persistent security information is false. We already know that. We don't have to use that either. But, remember, fewer characters in the middle tier makes a difference. User ID, SA, so forth. Initial catalog has already been set for you. The data source, of course, has been set to local. We're ready to go. And if we execute this, this is what I'm saying here is that I did not have to do anything special to create this connection string. No matter how complex the interface. If I was talking to a FoxPro or a JET or the directory service or the Farkle Star database that you just invented, that's all done for you. And building this connection string can be a PIA. That's another technical term. So we're leveraging this code. We don't steal code, we leverage it. Or you steal it from working code. Now, command objects. These are not required. They are required when you want to pull back the return status from a stored procedure. Absolutely required. No other way to get it. Or output parameters from a stored procedure. Both excellent ways to pass back data from a stored procedure, far, far more efficient than a record set. They're only helpful for dealing with input parameters. Again, not necessary. And it may give you improved query performance, but I would certainly look at the performance monitor. We're going to talk about the profiler, the old trace facility. And I leave that open on my desktop most of the time when I'm writing sample code to see what ADO told SQL Server. You told it to do what? And trying to figure out which options work and which don't, based on what the profile is being told. Yes, sir?
Just real quickly, if you do input parameters, is it better to do a string of the parameters, such as 20 parameters, or do all the add parameters and then add values?
The question is, should you write 20, 30 lines of code to say command.1 is equal to Fred, command.2 is equal to 5, command.3 is equal to 5? The answer in the middle tier is absolutely not. So in the active server page, that's no. It turns out that the COM referencing, and what you can do, you can say add new and give it two variant arrays. One has the variant array that has the name of the columns, and the other one a variant array that has the data. And the parameters can work the same way. And you can pass the parameters in the same way. In other words, you can pass in variant arrays that contain the parameters. That's faster. It also turns out that you have fewer COM references, faster. So you are, in fact, short-circuiting the whole operation. And it just, fine. And it just does it much faster. So individual referencing, not a good idea. Array referencing, faster.
But I'd always heard that doing individual items explicitly tell you everything about it so that video doesn't have to guess it, such as your type.
That's another issue. For example, one approach is when we're creating the parameters collection. Is that what you're referring to? When you're creating the parameters collection, question, should you use the refresh method or should you use the create parameter object append. Another interesting point. Now, my tests are not finished here, but I'm of the opinion, and it looks kind of leaning this way, that in the middle tier, in active server pages again, fewer lines means faster. Now, if we have a parameter collection that's got 40 elements in it, we've got 40 lines of code that has to be executed one by one, interpreted one by one, versus a refresh method, one line of code. However, the refresh method requires a hit to the server. Question, where's the server? Often local. Not a lot of network traffic, and it's a single store procedure call. So there's a trade-off. Where's that code being executed? In binary. So you have one line of interpreted code executing some binary code. So there may be a trade-off there. Question, when the structure changes, will the refresh method always work? The answer is probably, but will your hard-coded parameter collections work? No, they'll certainly have to be changed. So there's trade-offs. And I drone on and on about this in my new book. I just had all kinds of examples and pull all this together. So remember, this parameter collection is maybe the problem here. Building the parameter collection, and we're doing this in the middle tier. We're doing this in active server page or in an MTS COM+ component. You're building something that's going to be thrown away in a nanosecond anyway, or in 3 or 4 seconds if you're using that 8088. You also want to leverage the data view window. One of the problems with figuring out these parameter objects is, for example, who knows the data type if you're going to pass a date back? Not that kind of date. If you're going to pass a date back from a parameter, what data type you? What's the ADO data type? Anybody know? What's that now? 80 date type. No. Date time. No, Eddie, date time is not right. Thank you for playing, sir. I appreciate that. Most people think that. Many people think that. Yes, sir, in the back. 80 date time stamp. Isn't that bizarre? That's correct. It's absolutely bizarre. It turns out that ADO has a number of other bizarre techniques, and the C developers have their own. They'll say 80 Beaster or something like that makes them feel better. It's one of those, things. But the easiest way to figure this out is simply ask the data view window. For example, we go to the data view window here, and you've seen this guy before, haven't you? Here's our data view window, and yes, there are things on the screen. Go to our table or the stored procedure or whatever. Right-click, and we look at we expand this out here. And let's say we want to find what the year born, what is the data type here? Well, it says this is a small int, 80 small int. It turns out that it thinks, some of the parameters being passed through are int, so it's having to do some transmogrification. So that's certainly an easy way to figure out what these parameters should be, and this works against stored procedures, not against this version for some reason. I'm not sure why. There you go, the year low. Let's see what it looks like. Properties is an integer. Easy to do. So we can, in fact, use the constructive parameters collection by yourself. And one of the things I've seen a number of people create 40 parameter objects ahead of time and then populate them one by one as if they never heard of the append method. Or they append this pre-built object. But you can create the parameter and pass it in a single line of code. And again, reducing number of lines of code is better. We also encourage you to reuse these. If you're going to go to the trouble of creating a command object, try to figure out a way to reuse it. Now, this does not apply to the middle tier, of course. You don't have that option. But in client-server work, I often see applications where these are created in a click event. That's not where this gets built. This gets built in form load, form initialized, someplace early in the app where you build these objects. And build 40 command objects. Build them. One-time hit. And because you're connecting asynchronously, you're going to let those things go on without the user having to wait for that operation to take place. Smarter commands, we're also going to talk about using stored procedures. We're using command objects and returning output parameters, and we're going to be talking about leveraging this new SP execute SQL. We're going to want you to remember to balance use of the command object. Use it where necessary. And in all cases, you want to avoid use of the prepared property. Now, in the olden days, remember the olden days, been there, we used to use the prepare property to turn on the creation of temporary stored procedures, right? Execute a query, create a temporary stored procedure, and from that point forward, we executed the stored procedure, that little temporary stored procedure. And if you close the connection, those stored procedures were in fact cleaned up for you. And if you didn't, they got left over there. They got left on your system until tempdb felt up and your SA, hey, yeah, okay, I know it's at the barbecue. Yeah, tempdb's full again. Good. You want me to do what? I don't think it'll fit there, sir. So in SQL Server 6, 5, and 7, we've eliminated this problem. We exchanged it for another one. And in this case, the use of the prepare property causes some very alarming behaviors in ADO. Turn on your profiler if you don't believe me and watch what happens. It's not pretty. So you want to make sure to turn on profiler and also use NetMon to see what's being transmitted over the wire as you build these commands. Now, executing stored procedures are a good idea. We asked our VBits crowd a couple of weeks ago how many people were using stored procedures, and it turns out that most people were at this point. It's a great idea, although I did have a lady come up to me. He said, I just hired a consultant, and he said that stored procedures are slower, and we should not be using them. And I gave her an answer. It was almost 4 or 5 nanoseconds. Fire the consultant. Stored procedures can appear slower if you are constructing the interfaces to them, command object each time, if you're doing it that way. In other words, you're not leveraging the stored procedure itself. You'll find also that these stored procedures, many of them reduce record sets that are not updatable. But that's not the end of the world because we're supposed to be using stored procedures to do the updates too, right? Shake your head like this. Yes. So these stored procedures accept gazintas, these parameters, and they return the gazoutas, the parameters, the return status, and more complex multiple result sets. These are cool, but they require more business logic on the client than you may be willing to deal with. ADO lives and breathes for stored procedures. It's almost like these two groups are actually talking to each other. Not allowed to do anymore. And remember, all these stored procedures are exposed as connection methods. So all you have to do here is say, build a connection and create a record set ahead of time. Now, this record set can be tuned up. We can stick some additional code in here that say, I want a updatable record set. I want a key set record set, or whatever I'm doing on the server side. And build that record set up ahead of time, because it's not constructed for you, like as it is in an execute statement where you have to take the default. So if you don't want a fire hose cursor for some reason, you've lost your mind, you can in fact use this technique here. We'll simply open a connection and then execute that stored procedure and passing in the parameters. Remember, the last argument here is always the result set. Make sense? Okay. Yes, there is a question. You want to go back one again? Just a minute.
Is that only valid through automation? Like you're using C++, you only be able to do that through automation?
I can make no guarantees for C++, sir. I'm sorry. Maybe the gentleman in the back. Does that work in C++? He says in theory. Yes, sir, in the back.
Does that support key parameters?
Define keyed parameters. Is that the word you said?
Well, in the sense of, using a key name in a stored procedure and passing it as a key parameter on that line?
You mean like a named parameter in stored procedure? None of the interfaces, none of the old ADB or ODBC interfaces until ADO 2.6 support named parameters, if you will. In other words, you pass a parameter of Fred, @ Fred equals 12, comma, @ George equals 22. And those happen to be passed by name and not necessarily positionally. These are positional. And I have not experimented with 2.6. As I said, I have only seen it for a few days. So I suspect that there's a whole new paradigm opening up there. Whether it works or not with the existing tools is another excellent question. Yes, sir?
Do you have to pass in a record set if you're not getting a record set back from that state?
If you don't get a record set, you don't have to pass a record set. And if you want to just do something as insert where you don't get a record set back, maybe you don't have to do it. Okay.
Maybe, or
No. You do. If this record set option here is an option. This guy is an option. Okay. You do not have to pass that. So if you have a record set, you have a store procedure that does not return row set, you don't have to pass. Say again? You're not going to see the output parameters. You're not going to see the return status. Those are gone. So you're not going to be able to get those back in this technique. Okay, smarter record sets. These are required to handle the row set. Many of our professional developing organizations do not depend on row sets except when they are needed. I recommend the same thing. Don't ask for a set of rows when you don't need them. Start with output parameters. Start with return status. Then, and only when you need a set of rows, pull them back. Remember, the cursor default is the fire hose. Even that costs time and money and RAM to execute. We also suggest persisted disjointed record sets. And for these, you get, once you buy the record set, you've got a lot of power at your hands. You've got a lot of power that you can draw on. You can sort it, you can filter it, you can find it, you can seek against it. These are not required to handle the query execution. You do not have to build a record set to execute a query. You don't have to build them to do output parameters, nor to get the return status, or to perform updates and deletes and inserts and so forth. Those are not, record sets are not required for any of those cases, which can really cover an awful lot of the situations. Now, the default cursor. If you require a cursor, first, you have to consider that the default is not really a cursor. It is a mechanism designed to optimize the flow of data from the data providers to your client. And it bypasses all the cursor mechanisms. So once you get a row set back, it is then forward only, because there's no scrolling built in. It's read only, because there's no updatability being built in. None of that engine part is being turned on. And it's cache size 1, which is really irrelevant here because it's being blasted back to you regardless of the cache. There's nothing to cache and manage for you. You will discover that cursors are not needed for most queries. And in the olden days, in the VBSQL days, the DB-Lib days, we didn't have cursors at all. In those days, we coded with chalk, and it was really different. But they also, you'll find that these various cursors are not universally supported. So as you work with various data providers, you'll find that they are not supported everywhere. So in any case, you want to choose a record set, choose a cursor, choose the lightest weight one possible. Just pick just the columns you need by name. Don't use select star. So that star means, I don't care what comes back, man. Just give it to me. So Thursday afternoon, you code your application. Friday afternoon, somebody adds a blob column to that particular table. You are now SOL. So only fetch the rows you need. The rows you need now. And this seems like, obvious stuff. But so many developers come up to me and say, I got this 40,000 row table. I can't seem to get the stuff out of. Why is that slow? And all the 14 other people standing around the both say, duh. Because it's not the way you approach these problems. Yes, there are situations where you need to massage these rows. You do it on the server in the form of a stored procedure. You don't bring the rows to the client to crunch it. And I usually ask the person, you must have an extremely small font on that screen in order to be able to see 15,000 rows at once. Oh, no, actually, it's So always include a where clause and no more than a few dozen rows. And what I'm working with the SQL Server people to try to get them to give us a next record set built into the server. Okay. I know there's 15,000 rows out there that I may be wanting to browse through, or maybe a couple hundred. Maybe 500. Far too many for the user to see at once. They ask for the number of G.I. Joe things in the catalog, okay? There are 800 G.I. Joe things in the catalog. The customer's going to want to scroll through those. Question, should you rerun the query every time and start over again? Or should SQL Server be smart enough to say, I want the nth set of those rows? So give me the first 50. Now this is different than top. Okay. Give me the first 50. Give me the next 50. Give me the nth set. Interesting? Could you use that? Yeah. You tell them. Write that down and you tell them. I've told them. You also want to populate quickly. This means that you want to do a move last as quickly as you can. Get to the bottom of that record set to pull down those rows off the SQL Server. To make sure your local set is closed, the query operation in the server will be then closed. All your locks will be released. And if you don't populate quickly, you're facing a number of problems. You had a question?
Previously, when you said to bring back groups of records, how does that differ internally with the use of the absolute page properties?
The absolute page properties let you manipulate this cache that you've built and let you walk around in the cache. And it's really disjoint from that other operation that we're talking about. And we're really not looking at, you're looking at a client-side cache, not the server-side cache. So you're working with this small subset of the data. So if you have a cache of 10,000 rows, you can, in fact, work around that, but you're not doing the same thing. That would be cool if it was a service, if it was server implemented, so you could go through the absolute page. Yes, sir.
What kind of overhead do you have using scrollable cursors that are built into SQL Server today?
In other words, scrollable cursors that, like on server-side cursors you're talking about?
Right. So if your architecture is your stored procedure to take in the parameters you're talking about, then, obviously you have to open a forward-only cursor each time. Is that a lot of overhead to cut it for?
Not really. The forward-only cursor is the fastest way to move data from the server engine TDS format into the OLEDB providers and through to SQL to the backend. You'll also find that this has got cool animation. I believe my cool animation. Do you see this going? Where we have the read-only, forward-only, the static, and the read-write static. As you add more features, you will find that the performance, may go right off the scale, may require considerably more overhead and more delay, but you get more features. In other words, you have the ability to read-write to the cursor. However, as we work up in the pyramid, remember our pyramid, as we work up in the pyramid, we often can't afford to build a read-write cursor at all. We're finding that it requires stored procedures to do these updates. So for smaller databases, these may make sense. We also want to make sure we complete population, as I said before. We want to move last where it's supported. Moving next to record set into file is probably something you want to look at it for a performance reason. It doesn't always make a lot of sense. Why are you moving next through these record sets? Are you moving row by row into the grid? Moving row by row into a set of other controls? Maybe not a good idea, because there's lots of other methods to populate the grid. As we go back to our demo here, now I'm kind of rolling the dice, kids. This wasn't working earlier. Let's see if I can get this to work. How many connections do we have open here? That's just one. Let's just step through this. Dun, 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 dun. Please open. Thank you. We don't want to do this again. And we're going to F8 through that. Oh, good, it worked. Yes, I know you're upset with me. But we did, let's just comment out this line, and we'll F5 this time. What we end up with is a populated grid. Did you see me any looping through this thing? No. This, in fact, is not updatable, but it's clickable. And I can click here and pick up the columns and do whatever I want to with it. So this is not a bad approach. And all I did was set the record set to the record set. That's not hard to do, and it is extremely fast. The data source control, the DB grid can do that too, but there's another options you have to set there. So there are ways to populate these grids, and the point here is we're not looping through this. And in any case, never let your user in this loop. In other words, you show a row, ask the user if that's the row they want, and let them move next until you complete population. Otherwise, you're locking up resources on the server. The server hasn't finished your query. Now, ADO will try to complete it in the background for you, but it is still being held. Yes, sir, you had a question.
This doesn't work on the middle tier.
What's that now?
This doesn't work on the middle tier.
A binding to the grid like that on the middle tier is probably not an issue, unless you want that grid to show up on the server someplace.
So the idea that not using move next, if you're building server-side web application or web-based application, that's not going to help. I think there's other ways to get the data out of the record. So let me look at a couple more slides and see if we have that conversation again. So what you want to do here is you want to get that stuff out of the middle tier. So you use get rows is one approach. You can use get string. Get rows returns a variant array. Get string returns a delimited string. But there's another one here that you can use in the middle tier now. It's called save. You can save to a stream in ADO 2.5. And that stream can be formatted as XML. And that stream can then be sent back to another layer. So again, we're not using looping here to build something that's going to be constructed later, unless you're building a UDL, user-defined data type. We're going to talk about that if we move fast enough. So we want to pass smart data from place to place. There's lots of choices. The disjoint record set, as we've said, we can pick up a record set in the middle tier and give it to somebody. We can have a delimited string, pass it across. We can have a user-defined structure, something where we type def ourselves. We're going to look at each of these here in a second. What are you doing? He's moving data, I guess. And those, it seems to be, do I talk about those here or do I talk about those in the next session? I think I talk about those in the next session. In any case, we want to measure the performance of our operations. We want to see when connections are made more quickly and how many people we can get connected. We want to see how long it takes to start a query and whether or not it completes more quickly. And whether it completes more quickly in a production environment. Just because it completes quickly in the test lab doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in the production environment. We also want to see when the record sets get the answer back, not just they come back. Is the correct answer there? We also want to see how many more users per second we can support and whether or not things seem faster. Now, one of the things that I've done in my applications is to make things appear faster. Now, you know the copy utility we use in Windows, that extremely challenged copy utility that copies from, you pick up a directory and you can drop it someplace, right? And that little dialog that comes up, does the little file folders that move from place to place, does that improve performance? No, but it makes the application seem like it's working. Right? It makes it seem like it's actually, otherwise you would say, oh my God, system's dead again. I just copied a file. And it may, before I came out here, I was backing up a system and it said I had 1,384,962 minutes left before. So he sometimes gets confused. That's not helpful for the user either. So we want to make things seem faster by using hourglasses, using progress bars, using things that looks like, oh, we're zipping. Like the new Office installer, you've seen that? Where they throw up the dialog box and they have the progress bar just kind of clips along. Man, it just kind of clips along. And it gets to the end and starts over. It's unlike the access progress bar that kind of clips along, but what they do is every second of operation, they reduce the length it moves by half. So if it gets done quickly, it gets done very quickly. The progress bar kind of zips along and we're done. Okay. Otherwise, it kind of zips along and it gets kind of slow and it never seems to get to the end. You ever seen it actually get to the end?
No, I didn't think so. Because they don't know how long it's going to take. So there are tools that we can use to measure things, and these are not always obvious. Get tick count is what I use internally to figure out how long something takes. Now, this is the number of ticks since the system started. Warning, do not use timer. And for some of my earlier demos, I was using timer, and I would get 3 different answers in 3 different tests. I mean, like radically different answers. 12, 4, 16, 4, 3, 9, 12. So get tick count is really a easy to use API-based counter. The SQL profiler also affects performance. So if you're using this will slow things down, but it will tell you what's going on. And by looking at the profiler, you can see how ADO is constructing the queries, how it's approaching the problems. So when you're using the shape provider, something complex, it's a great idea to turn on the profiler. The query analyzer is also very cool. Now you're going to see this. I'm convinced that they're going to show this tool. This will show you how SQL Server will construct the query. In other words, how it's approaching the problem. It's going to do a table scan here. It's going to do an index scan here. But more importantly, you can push a button. It says, okay, figure out how to make it better. And it will suggest changes in the index structure. You know, if you added this index here and deleted this one, it would be 42.6% faster. And to do that, implement that change, you simply push another button. Say, okay, go ahead and do that. And have it do it for you. Now that's cool. Can I show us the button? Don't make me do that. This is not my server. Don't make me do that. You also want to look at netmon. Now, I haven't worked with netmon except for this last year when I started writing my new book. I wanted to see how much overhead was involved in moving, say, a record set back, or a delimited string back, or a varied array. And I discovered some very, very interesting things about the packets that are constructed and sent over the wire. You ask for 12 rows of something in a variant array versus 12 rows of something in a record set. What kind of volume differences are there as far as physical stuff getting moved over the wire? Variant arrays were startlingly ugly. They had all kinds of padding going on. It said like user. They padded the entire structure with this word user for some reason. And I had a number of the engineers say, why are you doing this? Oh, it's a calm profile, the atmosphere. Oh, well, yes, of course. So it was not at all clear why they were doing that, but that's what they were doing to build these structures. So also another good tool. So smarter users also play a role here. Smarter users ask fewer questions because they're happier. They are satisfied with what's going on here. They are smarter because you gave them better documentation on how the application actually is supposed to work. Because some users actually read the documentation. Some, not many. But if they are trained and you had better training, that also helps as well. Better support and better attitude on your part and the customer part also help this situation. So we can, in fact, get better performance in these systems. We can get there through better stuff that we've just discussed. This is all workable. This can do. This stuff does work. We've had a number of conversations, and this whole presentation was developed over the last year internally at Microsoft by suggesting things and having lots of people. What's your best practice? What's your best tip? And that's what you've seen here is a summary of all those. We're out of time for this, but I'm going to do this next session too, and it starts at 3:30. No, next. 1:15. At 1:15. Have an hour and a half nap. Oh my God! What am I going to do for an hour and a half? So I'm here as long as you want to answer questions. Thanks very much.